Over 50,000 Irish people were forcibly shipped to Caribbean plantations in the 1600s and died in horrific numbers, but calling them slaves erases what actually happened to both Irish and African people. Here's the real story they don't teach. Between 1649 and 1656, Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland, killed up to 40% of the population, and transported over 50,000 Irish men, women, and children to places like Barbados as indentured servants. But these weren't normal contracts. Families were ripped apart at auction, children torn from mothers, and people were sold like property with mortality rates so high that Barbados became known as the white man's grave. Irish women were forced into relationships with enslaved Africans as a deliberate breeding strategy to create more workers. It was ethnic cleansing through forced labor, and it was absolutely brutal. But here's why the term Irish slaves is historically wrong and why it matters. Indentured servitude, even the nightmare version the Irish faced, theoretically had end dates, usually 7 years. Your children weren't automatically born into it. You could eventually own property and testify in court. Chattel slavery imposed on Africans was legally different. It was hereditary, permanent, and racial. Enslaved Africans were property forever. Their children were property forever, bred and sold across generations with zero legal rights for centuries. Both systems were evil, but they were different evils with vastly different long-term impacts. And here's what gets erased when people compare them. Irish and African people in the Caribbean often rebelled together. The 1768 Montserrat Uprising was Irish and Africans fighting side by side against English colonial power. The British were terrified of that unity, so they created laws specifically to divide them, banning Irish Catholics from owning enslaved people to break those alliances. The real story isn't Irish slaves versus African slaves. It's that English colonizers brutalized both groups differently, then deliberately set them against each other to maintain control. Today, white supremacists love pushing the Irish were slaves too narrative to claim everyone was enslaved so racism isn't special, which erases 400 years of racial chattel slavery's unique generational trauma. But dismissing Irish suffering entirely also erases a real atrocity. The truth, Irish people were violently deported, sold, and died in massive numbers in Caribbean plantations. That's historical fact. It was forced labor, ethnic cleansing, and a campaign to destroy Irish Catholic culture. But it wasn't chattel slavery, and using that word distorts both histories. If you want to honor what happened, call it what?